Summer's supposed to be the easy season. So why are so many people quietly Googling a therapist between summer Fridays? Because more daylight doesn't fix the hard stuff. Sometimes it just turns the volume up. Grow does therapy differently. Therapy is not only for when you're in crisis. Grow Therapy is here for all the moments when you decide you want more. More support, more clarity, more tools. Mental health isn't a destination you reach, it's something you build, and Grow makes that easier. Grow connects you with thousands of high-quality licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. You can search by what matters, like insurance, specialty, identity, or availability, and get started in as little as 2 days. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. The therapist you want takes your insurance on Grow. Grow accepts over 125 insurance plans. Sessions average $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/booknow today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/booknow. growtherapy.com/booknow. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
History as it happens, July 31st, 2026. Sudan's unrelenting agony.
Another human rights catastrophe is unfolding in Sudan.
The conflict has caused the world's largest humanitarian crisis, displacing more than 13 million people.
For months, both sides have sought to seize supply lines around Obeid.
And the drone attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure has been increasing.
The complication in Sudan, which I wish were different, and we're very involved in this. I had a meeting on Sudan yesterday.
The number of women and girls requiring gender-based violence services in Sudan has quadrupled since the conflict began.
5 years ago, elated Sudanese, young and old, danced in the streets after countrywide protests brought down Sudan's 30-year dictator and indicted war criminal Omar al-Bashir.
70 years after Sudanese independence, the country continues to tear itself apart. Its latest civil war has displaced millions, killed unknown thousands, bearing witness to massacres, rape, starvation, and genocide. Some of Sudan's regional neighbors are prolonging the conflict. No one, it seems, is capable of stopping it. Sudan cannot escape its history. That is next as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
This is, in fact, the first genocide of the 21st century.
The UN has made a couple of decisions that seem to be remarkably indifferent, really. It hasn't played a leading role. It has said that this is an African problem and it should be solved by the Africans, knowing full well that the African countries surrounding Sudan are divided and that the key actors from outside are not African. So the Africans will not be able to solve it.
The world has gained a new nation. The Sudan, for 58 years under the joint rule of Britain and Egypt, becomes an independent republic. The Proclamation of Independence is read from the balcony of the House of Representatives in Khartoum, and the new flag is hoisted. Blue for the Nile, yellow for the desert, green for agriculture.
70 years since Sudan achieved independence from Britain and Egypt. 7 decades scarred by civil war and genocide. This month also marks 15 years since South Sudan formally seceded, and this young country's been bathed in blood too. 3 civil wars have consumed 43 of Sudan's 70 years as an independent nation-state, not counting the many years of violence and genocide in Darfur, which erupted in 2003.
First, a consistent and widespread pattern of atrocities, killings, rapes, burning of villages, committed by Janjaweed and government forces against non-Arab villagers. 3/4 of those interviewed reported that the Sudanese military forces were involved in the attacks.
It was during the first decade of this century when Sudan made front-page news because of Darfur, because of celebrity attention, namely George Clooney.
We started in South Sudan. It took 2 days to get to the border of Darfur. We heard there were a lot of refugees pouring south. We found a village called Jacques with over 1,000 displaced families.
What she's feeling when she's praying, kneeling at the
And in 2006, there was a rally on the National Mall in Washington with live music. Dozens of politicians, celebrities, human rights activists, and religious figures called on the world to stop the genocide. I'm sure you can recognize these two.
Today, we know what is right and we know what is wrong. The slaughter of innocents is wrong. 2 million people driven from their homes is wrong. Women gang raped while gathering firewood is wrong.
From all sides of the political spectrum, all of them are saying the same thing, that the U.S. policy, the UN, and the world's policy on Sudan is failing. World leaders will tell you that the policy will keep us from intervening. Well, fortunately, this is not a dictatorship. You make the policy.
That was Senator Barack Obama, followed by Clooney. Today, there are no rallies for Sudan. An ongoing civil war is now in its fourth year, with no end in sight. UN and U.S. mediation efforts, such as they are, have amounted to nothing. At a news conference in June at the UN, Pekka Haavisto, the personal envoy of the Secretary General for Sudan, said the warring sides still believe military victory is possible.
Is there some hope in the end of the tunnel? Of course, it depends how you look at one of the issues that we are trying to confirm with the parties is that there is no military solution to the conflict. It looks like both of the parties, General Hemeti, General Burhan, still think that something can be achieved militarily in this conflict.
Sudan's unrelenting agony may not be front of mind for most people, but it is not being ignored either. The recent fighting outside the strategically important city of El Obeid has drawn attention for its genocidal potential.
El Obeid has become the new front in the fighting between the Sudanese army and the RSF. At least 500,000 people there are trapped with limited food supplies. The UN has warned of a humanitarian catastrophe in the city, and last week said women were being raped just trying to get water.
Paramilitary forces of the RSF, Rapid Support Forces, have been attacking El Obeid, which is being defended by the Sudanese military, so far successfully, as thousands of displaced civilians poured into the city hoping to find shelter. The city is important militarily because it could open the way for the RSF to return to the capital, Khartoum. Volker Turk is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Another human rights catastrophe is unfolding in Sudan, this time in the capital of the strategic state of North Kordofan. Civilians have been subjected to siege-like conditions for 18 months, battered by relentless drone strikes as the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces battle for control over areas surrounding the city. My office documented 15 drone strikes on El Obeid and surrounding areas between 6 and 28 June, which killed at least 45 civilians and injured 41. The actual number of civilian casualties is likely higher. Across the Kordofan region, drones launched by both sides have repeatedly struck markets, schools, fuel stations, water infrastructure, and civilian vehicles.
Alex Duvall is our guest in this episode. He says the prospect for peace in Sudan is zero. Nearby countries are prolonging rather than trying to end the war. The United Arab Emirates is arming the RSF, which has a horrendous human rights record of genocide and rape as a weapon of war. All sides in this conflict have committed atrocities. Sudan cannot escape its history, and the so-called rules-based order does not exist there. Alex Duvall is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation and a professor at Tufts University. He is considered one of the world's foremost experts on Sudan and the Horn of Africa. And he is the co-author with Willow Berridge of a brand new book, The Sudans, Africa's Search for Peace, Democracy, and Two Viable States.
It's good to be with you.
So this year marks 70 years since Sudan's independence in 1956. It's also 15 years since the new nation of South Sudan officially, via public referendum, seceded to become a new country. But I wanted to revisit this subject with you, not because of anniversaries, but because of the very disturbing details that have been coming out of Sudan as this civil war now rages well into its fourth year. Let's start with what's been happening at a city in the middle of the country It is in North Kordofan province, which again is in central Sudan, despite the name North Kordofan. El Obeid, a very important city which has been surrounded by the Rapid Support Forces. What is happening there?
So El Obeid is besieged by the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, headed by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti. And it is defended by the Sudan Armed Forces, headed by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is also the de facto head of a Sudanese government that is recognized by the United Nations. The RSF is surrounding and besieging El Obeid and threatening to capture it. Now, this has two major issues of significance. The first is that it's a strategically important city. If the RSF captures it, the road will be open for the RSF to return in force to the national capital, Khartoum. The war started in Khartoum. The RSF fought heavily in Khartoum, but was driven out after nearly 2 years, and is obviously aiming to return there. And the road will be open should it capture El Obeid. But perhaps of greater significance is the worry about the humanitarian and human rights consequences, because the RSF has committed 2 enormous genocidal acts already in this war. Right in the first few weeks of the war, RSF militiamen overran a city called El Geneina near the border with Chad, home to the ethnic Masalit group, and massacred thousands, possibly tens of thousands. And then they surrounded and besieged the city of El Fasher, a city when they started besieging it of about a million people. And as the siege tightened, they overran outlying areas. Some people fled. And by the time they attacked the city after 500 days of starvation siege, this was in October of last year, there were about 100,000 or so people left. And almost all of those people are unaccounted for, some 6 to 8 months on. What we know is, by their own admission, the RSF killed at least 7,000 civilians. And there's the most horrific footage of fighters rampaging, murdering people, capturing people who are trying to flee, etc. Most appalling stories. And the fear is that should they overrun El Obeid, then we will see a repeat of these atrocities.
The people are stuck there with really no way out. There's lots of food insecurity, and there's fear of mass killings and mass rape as well.
That's correct. The fears are slightly assuaged this week because the army managed to bring in a relief convoy and won some battles on the road. It says it's opened the road. But this is a war that goes backwards and forwards, and every time each side says we have gained a decisive victory, we have, got the other side on the back foot, it doesn't last long. So we still have every reason to fear.
So the RSF, Rapid Support Forces, they go back to the dictator al-Bashir, who was deposed in 2019. He had the RSF as a personal militia, if you will. He needed them just in case the army came after him. So the RSF, under a general, Mohammed Hamdan, known as Hemeti, and what is now the Sudanese Armed Forces, they're led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. These two warlords got together, they cooperated to get rid of al-Bashir. There were mass demonstrations, calls for a new constitution, some semblance of a democratic transition. That did not work out. The two generals interfered with that process. To make a somewhat long story shorter, their rivalry exploded into this current civil war. So this is really a war between two warlords competing militaries for control of the country, right? There's no high principle at stake.
That's correct. So the spark for the war was a dispute over the status of the RSF within the armed forces, because it had been, as it were, an autonomous branch of the army. And as part of the negotiations between the two, with the third party to the negotiations being the civilians who were supposedly to return to some sort of role, there was a disagreement as to whether the RSF should come under the army or whether it should remain autonomous for a number of years. And obviously, Burhan wanted to assert control over them. Hemeti wanted autonomy for as long as it took for him to organize himself to become the next president of Sudan. And that led to Hemeti trying to stage a coup d'etat, which didn't work. And his forces then rampaged through the city. And what this did was it unlocked old unsolved problems, and it sparked a whole lot of new problems within Sudan. So the RSF was born from a notorious militia known as the Janjaweed that was responsible for large-scale killings in Darfur some 20, 25 years ago.
I concluded, that genocide has been committed in Darfur, and that the government of Sudan and the Janjaweed bear responsibility, and that genocide may still be occurring.
The genocidal project of some of those militia was still unfinished. And the first killings of the Masalit in El Geneina that I spoke about a few moments ago was, as it were, the unfinished business of that war. So in mobilizing militia forces on both sides, all sorts of local grievances were then surfaced and all sorts of local vendettas could be pursued. But then we also had a lot of new vitriol, new discontent, because major cities like Khartoum itself, like another city called Wad Medani just to the south of Khartoum, had essentially been protected during Sudan's long wars. People who lived there had lived in safety. They had lived in mixed neighborhoods. They had lived normal lives until the RSF came through looting, destroying, raping, and killing, and creating a huge amount of hatred and feelings of vengeance and hurt.
So within these two militaries, or within the civil war, there are lots of local militias who are wreaking havoc at different levels here. It's a very difficult war to follow on the battlefield. You recently gave a talk where you said peace is not possible in Sudan right now. Is either side winning? What would victory even look like?
So the government talks about total victory. It talks about completely defeating and disbanding the RSF. And frankly, that is not in prospect. Even if it were a lot more powerful, it wouldn't be able to do that. No Sudanese government has ever ended a war with absolute victory. There has to be a peace agreement. And up to now, there hasn't been an effective peace process. And this is partly because the two sides are so far apart and so distrust one another. And it's not because they have really conflicting political visions. There are political differences between them, but it's purely down to rivalry and acrimony.
Sure.
And it's partly because of external factors too.
Tap subscribe now in the show notes to skip ads, get early access, and enjoy all of our bonus content. Or go to historyasithappens.com. And as you say, history playing a role here too. Historical grievances are revived once these two warlords start to go to war with each other 3 years ago.
So there's a lot of unresolved business.
Yeah. On that note, let's talk now about South Sudan, seceded via referendum, becomes a new country in 2011. How did that event help lead to this mess today?
So a little bit of background. So Sudan was put together by the British and the Egyptians more than 100 years ago. And it's a very diverse country. And the most striking element of diversity was a contrast between the north, that is predominantly Arabic-speaking, predominantly Muslim, and the south, which was a mixture of traditional, what they call noble spiritual beliefs, and with Christian missionaries and Muslims there too. And that led to a succession of civil wars. And the resolution of the longest running of these wars, which was achieved in negotiations sponsored by the neighboring states, supported by the UN, and especially by the United States, led to something called the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, 2005.
Since 2005, the ceasefire has, for the most part, held. Northern troops have pulled out of the south, and a new government of national unity was formed in Khartoum. A regional government of southern Sudan was created in Juba. Oil wealth has been shared with the south. The parties have made progress on some of the disputed border areas of Abyei and have passed legislation to prepare for elections and the 2011 referenda on self-determination.
And that was Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in 2010. Go ahead.
Would the South Sudanese remain part of a united Sudan, or would they take the option of independence? 2011, they voted overwhelmingly for independence, and there was indeed a peaceful separation in July of 2011, hailed at the time as a wonderful achievement. But there was some unfinished business there too.
Oil.
Sudan was, for the first decade of this century, a middle-ranking oil producer, and that was its major source of revenue and foreign exchange. 3/4 of the oil was in South Sudan. So when the two countries separated, South Sudan immediately became a middle-income country, but highly oil-dependent country. 97% of government revenue was from oil. And there are all sorts of problems that arise when you have that sort of hyper-dependence on oil. And meanwhile, the North, suddenly bereft of its oil income, went off a sort of fiscal cliff. So there was a plan to resolve this problem as part of the negotiations for the peaceful separation of South Sudan. Now, I was a member of the team under former South African President Thabo Mbeki, the African Union high-level panel that facilitated these talks. And actually, this is the subject of the book that I've just published with Willow Barrage called The Sudans. And the core of this was a plan for two viable states. And the deal essentially was this: South Sudan would secede, get all its oil, and it would also secede debt-free. Northern Sudan would still shoulder the burden of something like $60 billion in international debt. But the proviso was that the two would work together with the United States and the international community to get the sanctions on Sudan lifted. It was listed as a state sponsor of terror and had all sorts of sanctions, which would then lead to an expedited debt relief program. The South Sudanese would also pay over the odds for 3 years for shipping its oil through northern Sudan to get it to market, and the northern Sudanese would have an austerity budget. Now, that didn't work out, and the reason it didn't work out was primarily that the two leaders, Omar al-Bashir in Khartoum and the new president in South Sudan, Salva Kiir, were not able to get their rather quarrelsome juniors in line. And a whole host of disputes, really unnecessary disputes, unfolded on the border and in a part of northern Sudan called the Nuba Mountains. And what that did was it led to a complete cessation in cooperation between the two. And South Sudan actually halted its oil exports, which was shooting itself in the foot because it therefore lost almost all its revenue. And the United States did not lift sanctions. And therefore, the worst case scenario unfolded of both countries going over the economic cliff, both countries being consumed by acrimonious politics leading to civil war.
And that conflict continues to this date. That is unresolved. Is that right?
South Sudan was the first to go into civil war, and they did have a peace agreement called the ARCIS Resolution on Conflict in South Sudan 2016, but it hasn't resolved the major issues. There's still fighting ongoing. President Salva Kiir is still in power. There haven't been elections. And meanwhile, in northern Sudan, the economic crisis that unfolded was one of the sparks for the overthrow of President Bashir.
In 2019. So the oil issue is still unresolved.
In principle, it is resolved. Okay. But the legacy of failing to resolve it, the legacy of the economic turmoil that followed, the failure to get debt relief, the desperation that followed in both countries has meant that we now have a legacy of chaos, disruption, poverty, and war.
And thank you for clarifying that. So just to recap, Sudan's first civil war started a year before independence. 1955 ended in 1972 with the Addis Ababa Agreement granting southern autonomy. But then that autonomy was revoked by Khartoum in 1983, leading to another civil war that lasted 22 years, roughly 2 million people killed. And the Sudan People's Liberation Army was the leading military force in the south of the country during that civil war. That is the South Sudanese military today. So as you mentioned, it ends in 2005 with a comprehensive peace agreement referring to the Second Civil War. And then that leads to South Sudan seceding via referendum in July of 2011, 15 years ago this month.
And now to South Sudan, which begins voting Sunday on separating from the north.
In the local stadium, a graduation ceremony yesterday for the new police class quickly turned into a rally for separation.
The voting is supposed to be the culmination of a 2005 peace deal between Sudan's government and the Southern Sudan People's Liberation Movement, or SPLM, which ended 2 decades of fighting.
We have to also keep in mind that it was during that second civil war that the Darfur genocide happened, starting in 2003. So today, the outside influence is a huge factor here. Maybe this didn't exist in those earlier conflicts. According to an article written in 2024, 2 years ago, by the Wilson Center, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Qatar, Algeria, Libya, UAE, Turkey, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Russia, China, Chad, and South Sudan have all interfered in this civil war that's been going on for more than 3 years now. Let's start with the UAE, which continues to deny that it's sending weapons to the RSF, even though everyone knows it does. What is the United Arab Emirates' interest in prolonging the war in Sudan?
So there's really no doubt that the UAE is by far the biggest provider of external military support to the war in Sudan, and that it is supporting the RSF. The UAE denies it, and one of the problems about that is that it is therefore impossible to have a conversation with the UAE at any level about what are its interests, what would it take for the UAE to come to the table or to step back. So there's a lot of speculation about it. Some people talk about gold because it gets a lot of gold from Sudan. It's invested in land in Sudan. But to me, these don't add up. These commercial interests are simply not commensurate with the scale of the commitment. And I suspect it comes down to a much bigger UAE strategic positioning in the world today, whereas it sees itself quite correctly at the fulcrum of some of the most difficult and contested issues around the world. And it wants a strategic depth, a strategic perimeter. And above all, it wants to be able to position itself in the economic wars that are unfolding, the currency wars and so on, as a very small, very vulnerable country in a very, very hot position, having access to not just to Sudan, but to Ethiopia, more broadly in Africa, to other parts of the Middle East, is a way of strategically, as it were, spreading its influence, getting access to resources, etc.
Ethiopia, Eritrea also have supported the RSF. Is any outside power, regardless which side they're supporting, actually trying to end the war, or are they prolonging it by militarily supporting their favored side? Are they prolonging it for selfish interests?
So I think there's no doubt they're prolonging it. So there is a coalition sort of on the other side that has been less active, but increasingly providing assistance to the Sudanese army. And that includes Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey prominently. Also, Eritrea, which earlier supported the RSF, has come into that coalition.
So
now.
what's like Saudi Arabia's interest then? What do they want out of Sudan?
Saudi Arabia has been in some very fierce rivalry with the UAE over the last few years for leadership in the Middle East as a whole. There are signs over the last couple of weeks that they may be patching up their differences because of the war with Iran, which threatens them both. But it's too early to say whether that's going to have any impact on Sudan. There's a sort of regional power struggle.
And Sudan is the playground.
Yemen was another playground for this, and the Horn of Africa more broadly. And it was in recognition of this that the Trump administration, that Secretary Rubio a year ago put together what he called the Quad, which is 4 countries, of which the US is one: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, to say, we, first of all, as the 4 of us, we need to come to a common understanding. And then if we successfully do that, we can then push the Sudanese belligerents, the RSF and SAF, to an agreement. This was the analysis from very early on. The Biden administration had this analysis on its table. It didn't do it. It needed presidential time, or it needed Secretary of State Antony Blinken to put in a few days' work. They didn't do that. They simply said this is not sufficiently important with all the other things that they were concerned with, like Ukraine, like Taiwan, later on Gaza. So they didn't prioritize it. Rubio, to his credit, did, but he hasn't managed to bridge that gap.
Yeah, so we're working hard at it. We know who the parties are that are involved. These things, that's why they're part of the Quad, along with other countries involved. And so I can just tell you at the highest levels of our government, that case is being made and that pressure is being applied to the relevant parties. I don't want to get into calling anybody out in a press conference today, because what we want is a good outcome here. This needs to stop. I mean, they're clearly receiving assistance from outside that's allowing them. And clearly that assistance isn't just coming from some country that's paying for it. It's also coming from countries that are allowing their territory to be used to ship it and transport it. So that, in order for this to be solved, that needs to be addressed. I don't know if you saw the RSF a few days ago agreed to humanitarian ceasefire, but they don't intend to comply with it. And when you raise the issue of these atrocities, they always hide behind the argument that this is rogue elements. Well, it's not rogue elements. They're doing it systematically, and it's something that we have taken very seriously and are doing everything we can to bring the relevant countries to the table to stop it. It needs to end.
The key issue over the last 12 to 18 months was to get Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Zayed, the president of the UAE, to come to a common position. The nature of politics in that part of the world, and particularly between these two, is it needs to be handled with a great deal of tact and sensitivity, because neither of them want to lose face. Each of them would need to acknowledge that sufficient respect has been afforded to them in making a compromise. This is a task that really only the White House can do. And unfortunately, President Trump is not known for his diplomatic finesse. So that when Mohammed bin Salman visited Washington in November of last year and raised Sudan, what President Trump really should have done was to say to the Saudi Crown Prince, I've heard you, I'm going to deal with this quietly, then spoken to Mohammed bin Zayed and asked Mohammed bin Zayed to make a concession to him, President Trump. And the two could have made an agreement jointly to President Trump. Sure. Instead, what President Trump did was he announced that he was acting on behalf, at the request of Mohammed bin Salman, which made it impossible for MBZ, as he's known, to respond. So that was a missed opportunity.
So if anyone looks at Sudan on a map, they can see it's surrounded by Eritrea, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Central African Republic, Chad, Libya, Egypt. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are separated by the Red Sea. So they're not contiguous to Sudan. They're not accepting, as far as I know, that many Sudanese refugees. These other countries that are next to Sudan and are accepting, in some cases, more than 1 million refugees, it would seem they have an interest to bring peace to that country. I guess that's why this is so confounding and so terrible, to prolong a war and the misery of people because you're making money over it.
There doesn't seem to be a workable formula for peace in Sudan. Now, so 15 years ago, at the time of the independence of South Sudan, it was possible to sort of thread the needle of getting all the neighbors, all the international players on the same side. That required a coordinated approach by the African Union, that's President Thabo Mbeki, the United Nations, the League of Arab States, and the United States. It was possible to do it then. Much more difficult now because of this, especially Saudi and Emirati rivalry. And the United States is really now the key player. The UN and the African Union are essentially missing in action. And I'm afraid what this means is that what is already the world's largest, most severe humanitarian crisis is set to get worse.
Why is the UN missing in action?
The UN has made a couple of decisions that seem to be remarkably indifferent, really. It hasn't played a leading role. It has said that this is an African problem and it should be solved by the Africans, knowing full well that the African countries surrounding Sudan are divided and that the key actors from outside are not African. So the Africans will not be able to solve them.
It's affecting a large part of the globe.
Exactly.
Africa is not a tiny place. So I don't
Precisely.
understand.
This, I think, will be among the most signal failures of the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, when he steps down at the end of this year.
Let me be clear. The United Nations is not leaving Sudan. Our commitment is to the Sudanese people in support of their wishes for a peaceful and secure future. We stand with them at this terrible time. I've authorized the temporary relocation both inside and outside Sudan of some United Nations personnel and of families. I call on all Council members to exert maximum leverage with the parties to end the violence, restore order, and return to the path of the democratic transition. We must all do everything within our power to pull Sudan back from the edge of the abyss.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to explore a historical force that has been behind so many of the world's conflicts over the past century or more: ethnic nationalism. What is it and why does it matter today? That is next as we report History as It Happens. And make sure to follow my free newsletter on Substack. Just go to Substack and search for History as It Happens.